One of the best bits of writing advice I've ever received came to me in a college playwriting class. Now, I had never written a play before that class, but I was interested in the medium, and I have to say the work I did for that class was some of the most enjoyable work I did during my failed tenure as a creative writer. I still remember the one on one I had with the professor towards the end of the semester when he looked me in the eye and told me, I know you're not going to finish the play you're planning on submitting for your final. I don't want you to. I want you to submit it to me where it is and then keep working on it. As strange as it seems, he was the first professor to admit that creative work doesn't always fit into the academic time frame and was willing to accept it. And, to be fair, he was 100% right. It's been almost 10 years now and I'm still not finished with it. I still go back and rewrite parts of it to this day. That wasn't the best bit of advice I got, though. The advice was to always think about why your play is starting when it's starting. Consider changing the start date by a week. Does the story still work? If it does, your play is not starting at the right time. He wanted us to always make sure our plays started exactly when they were supposed to, and have a good reason to start there. Now, do I think the ultimate message is to be super concerned about dates? Like, my play can only work on October 18th kind of stuff. No. He just wanted us to think, and I mean really think, about when our plays started. Now, why do this? Well, for starters, I know we all have that one friend or coworker or family member who will get halfway through a story and go, "Oh, I forgot you don't know Joe," and then start in on some big tangent about Joe and the party at Kate's house last week, which is fine for your day to day human interactions, but is unacceptable for written, planned out work. You can't just introduce a crucial character with an intricate backstory randomly in the middle of your work. Unless you're Parks and Rec, who added two of the most beloved main characters at the start of season 3, though it is telling that a lot of fans will skip the first two seasons on rewatch and just act like season 3 was the start. Now, for this podcast, I don't often have to consider start dates too much. I usually start with the storyteller's birth, usually with a little segment about their parents, and go from there. I work in a largely chronological order. The one variation being Poe, where I did a little shocker there and started with Poe's grandfather instead of his father, just to mess with you. But why mention this now? Well, to start us off on our discussion of John Neal, we're not going to start at our normal place. We're not going to start with his parents or even his grandparents. We're starting in the modern day. April 8th, 2024, in fact. Now, you may say we're entering unexplored territory here, but you couldn't be more wrong. We're entering very explored territory here. So much so that we're starting with a quotation from, well, me. April 8th, 2024, I published the Poe episode. In it, I said something to the effect of, on April 15th, 1829, Edgar Allan Poe is discharged. Before heading to West Point, Poe moves to Baltimore for a few months to live with his Aunt Maria Clem, his first cousin Virginia Clem, his brother Henry, and his grandmother Elizabeth. This is Poe's first time living with blood relatives since his mother died when he was 2 years old. He's 20 now. During this time, Poe finishes some poems and puts them together in a collection called Al Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems. He sends an advanced copy to John Neal, a prominent critic of the time. Neal gives Poe, in Poe's own words, quote, the very first words of encouragement I ever remember to have heard, unquote. Wouldn't it be cool if we knew what those words were? Well, it turns out we do. Neal wrote, quote, He will deserve to stand high, very high, in the estimation of the shining brotherhood. Whether he will do so, however, must depend not so much upon his words now in mere poetry as upon his words hereafter in something yet loftier and more generous. We allude to the stronger properties of the mind, to the magnanimous determination that enables a youth to endure the present, whatever the present may be, in the hope, or rather in the belief, the fixed, unwavering belief that in the future he will find his reward. Unquote. Neal later concludes that Poe, and I quote, might make a beautiful and perhaps magnificent poem. There's a good deal here to justify such a hope. That section I wrote about Poe was my introduction to John Neal, a name that showed up praising Poe. Now, this comes up a lot during research for this podcast. I'll see some name called out as a prominent literary figure of the time, and it's a name I've never even heard of. I'll quickly check them out, and if they're notable, I'll usually give them a little blurb in the show. But for the Poe episode, I cut out most of my blurbs because the episode was long, and I found way too many people. If you listened all the way to the end of the Poe episode, you'll know that I had planned to do a whole episode on the people I found researching Poe, but that never came to be. Instead, we're going to do a whole episode on John Neal, the man I have dubbed the weird uncle of American literature. He had no great novel, just some mediocre ones. His poetry never really touched the American soul the way he wanted. His short stories have some influence, maybe, but I'd be shocked if any non-Neal scholars today would even recognize the names of them. And yet, here he is, a prominent shaper of the trajectory of American literature all the same. We'll cover his life, his role in shaping the American literary movement, his influence on other writers, and the surprising side notes that come from examining a life like Neal's. But first, a little bit of Bach. Alright, I'll be honest. I have nowhere else to include this thought, and it may be a reference only relevant to me, but I want to make it anyway. John Neal is the literature world's equivalent of Paul Morphy. Paul Morphy was an American chess prodigy in the mid-1800s. He was considered the strongest player of his time and is regarded as one of the best chess players of all time. For those of you who are chess historians or watch too many Agad Mator videos, you know how Paul Morphy's story ends. John Neal's literary story will end pretty much the same way. For those of you who aren't chess historians, well, you'll just have to wait. But those who know chess history get a little forewarning. Consider this my little lesson for you. Knowing seemingly random things like chess history sometimes gives you little bonuses in seemingly unrelated places, like literature podcasts. But enough about that for now. Let's start from the very beginning. A very good place to start. August 25th, 1793. John Neal Sr., a schoolteacher by trade, and Rachel Hall Neal welcome to the world their two children. Twins, a boy and a girl. And what do John and Rachel name their children? Why, John and Rachel, of course. Because people back then knew that one day some sucker like me would try to make a podcast about them, so they gave everyone the same name just to make things harder. But joke's on them. John Neal Sr. would die about a month after the twins were born, and Rachel Neal, the daughter, plays no real role in this story. So we are left, really, with one John and one Rachel, a mother and her son. Rachel Hall Neal was an educated woman. She knew she needed to start working to provide for her new children. To make ends meet, she rented rooms in her home and founded a school in the Quaker community she belonged to. John Neal Sr.'s brother, James Neal, would also help the family out, occasionally sending them some money. Growing up, John Neal Jr., who we'll just call John Neal from here on in, attended both his mother's school and the local public school in Portland, Massachusetts. Now, you might be thinking that Portland is in Oregon, and you're right, but this is a different Portland. But you're probably also thinking that the other Portland is in Maine, not Massachusetts, and you're right again. However, Maine wouldn't be established until 1820. We're not there yet. We're in the first decade of the 1800s. At that time, what we know as Maine still belonged to Massachusetts. In public school, John Neal would be bullied by students and the schoolmaster. This would instill in John Neal an anger and a tendency towards violence. He would spend the rest of his life looking for productive outlets for these feelings. At the age of 12, John Neal realized that staying at home was placing a financial burden on his mother, so he moved out. He picked up jobs at a haberdashery and as a dry goods salesman throughout his teenage years. And while working as a salesman, John Neal learned some less than reputable business practices. Things like counterfeiting money or misrepresenting the goods he sold. Remember, these are the early years of America as a nation. Regulation was not exactly a priority. This is, if you'll pardon the chronological issues with this statement, the Wild West of early New England. Now, selling dry goods was tough during this time, largely due to the constant on-again, off-again embargoes on British goods due to the lead-up and aftermath of the War of 1812. Now, we talked about war a lot during our last 3 episodes, so I'll skip the war talk about 1812. Just know that the US would embargo the import of British goods, making it hard to get inventory to sell. This led to salesmen, or sales boys as the case may be, like John Neal, being constantly laid off. So John Neal traveled throughout the modern-day Maine part of Massachusetts, working as a penmanship instructor and a portrait artist. By 1814, John Neal was 20 years old. He had experienced ups and downs since he left home and was in a relatively down place when he heard about a store in Boston. He left Maine and moved to Boston to work at this new store, and while there he meets John Pierpont. Neal and Pierpont would become quick and lasting friends. And we'll take a moment to talk about Pierpont here. He was a businessman and a poet when Neal met him, and he would go on to be one of the most well-known American poets of his day with the publication of The Heirs of Palestine. He would also go on to found a literary society called the Delphian Club. Baltimore was, around this time, called the Rome of America, due to its literary and cultural focus. So Pierpont, being clever, founded a club named after the ancient oracle of Delphi. Pierpont would go on to be a nationally recognized teacher and pastor, known for his strong beliefs about temperance and abolition. As a 76-year-old man, Pierpont would join the Civil War as a chaplain and would later work in the Treasury Department before his death. Now, despite there being some rumors that he wrote Jingle Bells, the popular Christmas song, as far as I can tell, he didn't. His son James Pierpont did. The confusion likely arose from the original version of the song, which only said it was, quote, written and composed by J. Pierpont. Some people incorrectly assumed the J was for John, not James. This is the problem with naming your children names that are close to yours. Back in the life of John Neal, Pierpont, Pierpont's brother-in-law, and Neal pooled their money together and started a business. Taking advantage of the embargo on British goods, the three of them smuggled the goods to America. They sold those goods in a store they owned in Boston. Business was so good, they eventually expanded to Baltimore and Charleston as well. Unfortunately for the trio, the U.S. ended the War of 1812 in 1815 and ended its embargo of British goods. This left Neal, Pierpont, and Pierpont's brother in law bankrupt and destitute, their budding business ruined, basically overnight. After almost a decade of good times and bad, often dictated by the U.S.'s embargoes, John Neal was now a man, ambitious, self reliant, and dedicated. John Neal was ready to crawl out from his bankruptcy and forge a new future for himself. This future would start in Baltimore. John Neal lived in Baltimore from 1816 to 1823. In 1823, he'll leave Baltimore for London. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Everything I'm about to tell you happened over a 7-year stretch. But first, the smuggling business with Neal wasn't John Pierpont's only business venture. He also owned a literary journal called The Portico with Tobias Watkins and several other friends. 2 months after filing for bankruptcy, John Neal started submitting essays and other written works to the Portico. New to the world of writing and friends with the owners, John Neal was never paid for his submissions. That being said, in the 2-year life of the Portico, John Neal was one of, if not the, most prolific contributor. At the same time, he was apprenticing with local lawyer William H. Winder. Neal wanted to write for magazines, write novels, and study law all at the same time. So he did. Now, he wasn't paid for his work in the magazine. He was just a law student, not really getting paid for that either, so he needed a way to make money. And his plan for income was the novel writing, at least until he could be a full lawyer. The only problem with that was that America didn't really have a novel writing scene. Less than 70 novels had been published in America at that point, and only one man had really made any money from it: American legend Washington Irving. So what made Neal think he could make money? Well, John Pierpont wrote a roughly 6,000 word poem called The Heirs of Palestine, and don't worry, I'm not going to read it to you, but it was popular and it made Pierpont a little bit of money. Emboldened by his friend's literary success and the positive reviews he got for his work for the Portico, John Neal's heart was set on being a novelist. In 1817, he published his first novel, Keep Cool. Keep Cool was representative of Neal's desires for an American literature genre all its own. This was the central debate of early American literature. What would our literature look like? Some were happy with American literature just being British literature written on a different continent, but Neal was not one of those people. He wanted American literature to reflect America itself. He wanted characters to speak like Americans, not the proper English writing used by the British. So, for Keep Cool, he became the first American to write American diction into a printed work. Now, his pioneering voyage was met with pretty harsh criticisms. Keep Cool was a financial and critical flop and failure. Now, whether Neal had a point or not, it didn't really matter. Keep Cool was not going to influence the world because the world didn't like it. But John Neal was not discouraged by the failure of Keep Cool. In 1818, he was given a task by magazine owner Hezekiah Niles. Hezekiah Niles owned the Weekly Register, the first weekly news magazine in the United States, and the most popular magazine at the time. The task was simple in concept: create an index for the last 6 years of the magazine. In practice, Hezekiah described it as, quote, the most laborious work of the kind that ever appeared in any country. It took Neal 4 months, working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. He was paid $200 for his effort. After a long day of working on the magazine, Neal liked to come home and sit at his desk and relax by writing poetry. This led to his first volume of poems, Battle of Niagara, a poem without notes, and Gold Owl or The Maniac Harper. Spending all day working only to come home and work more, John Neal is officially writing like he's running out of time. He writes day and night like he's running out of time. 1819 sees John Neal publish his first play. He also takes a job with a newspaper and actually gets paid for it, unlike his work for the Portico, which ended in 1818. In addition to his editing duties, Neal became America's first daily columnist. Poet and historian Paul Allen, a member of the Delphian Club, wrote and published a book titled History of the American Revolution. Well, it was published under his name. John Neal and Tobias Watkins, two other members of the Delphian Club, did the actual writing. Neal is estimated to have written about 2/3 of it, with Watkins taking the other third. And Allen wrote the preface, so at least he contributed something. This literary work sustained John Neal as he worked as a law apprentice and studied for the bar. In 1820, John Neal was finally admitted to the bar and started working as a lawyer. Not dependent on literary work to sustain him financially anymore, Neal relaxes for a little bit. He was still an editor and a contributor for local magazines and whatnot, but nothing as insane as working 16 hours a day than coming home to work more. And that's not to say he was idle. He would release one novel in 1822 and three more in 1823. In one of his three 1823 novels, 76, Neal was using his signature style. His characters spoke like real-life people using slang and colloquialisms unique to America. One of those colloquialisms was a landmark moment in print. In the novel 76, we have the first documented use of the phrase, son of a biscuit. Except he, didn't say biscuit. This is a PG show, remember. 1823 saw Neal publish 3 novels, but it also saw Neal burn bridges at a prodigious rate. And I'm not talking about a career in arson, this is, relationship bridge burning. 1823 saw him quit the Delphian Club, and from what we could tell, it was not a happy exit. The year also saw William Pinckney, former Attorney General, pass away. John Neal in Randolph, one of his other 1823 novels, criticized Pinckney, calling him slovenly and a bad public speaker. While Neal wrote these criticisms before Pinckney's death, Pinckney died before Randolph was printed. Neal decided to just leave the criticisms in, which irked Pinckney's son, Edward Coote Pinckney. Edward would call for a duel, which Neal quickly declined. John Neal hated dueling. He thought it was a barbaric, out-of-date practice. Edward Pinckney and John Neal would instead trade barbs in print, starting a minor war of the words between the two. Seeing as he wasn't making new friends in Baltimore, and he was quickly losing his old ones, John Neal decided he'd had enough. So, on December 15th, 1823, Neal hops on a boat and heads to London. During the 7 years he spent in Baltimore, Neal was an editor, a journalist, a poet, a novelist, a law student, and eventually a lawyer. He reportedly learned to read and write in 11 languages, published 7 novels, studied law well enough to be admitted to the bar, and was a constant contributor to local literary magazines. That's pretty good for a lifetime, let alone 7 years in your 20s. But John Neal is leaving Baltimore and his 20s behind, He's just turned 30 and he's headed to London. His goals are threefold: become the leading voice on American literature, bring about an American literary style distinct from the British literary style, and make the British respect American authors. That last point was driven by a phrase uttered by Sydney Smith. Smith was an English writer who once said, quote, "In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book?" Unquote. That phrase became popular and was a driving force behind Neal's desire to see American literature respected. Another goal of Neal's was to republish his previous works over in England. However, due to the lack of any real international copyrights, British publishers had been publishing Neal's work for free. When he came over and wanted to be paid, they laughed at him. If you remember from our talk about Poe, he had the same problem. American publishers wouldn't pay Poe because they could just publish English works for free. In the same way, English publishers won't pay Neal because they can just publish American works for free. This is the Wild West of international copyright laws. Neal, who had come to London with limited funds, was now facing a dilemma. He couldn't sell his work to make money, and he wasn't really prepared for that. However, a British magazine owner decided to gamble. William Blackwood, owner of Blackwood's magazine, decided to hire John Neal to contribute to his magazine. In doing so, John Neal became the first American to publish work in an English literary journal. Neal's first piece for Blackwood's magazine was a rundown of the American presidential election. It was a four-man race. The candidates were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote and had the most electoral college votes. However, he didn't have enough to be made president. So there was what's called a contingent election that, somewhat controversially, elected John Quincy Adams. Rumors swirled that Henry Clay had swayed the vote by supporting Adams in exchange for an appointment as Secretary of State. Now, whether that rumor was true or not, Clay did become Secretary of State under Adams. Andrew Jackson, furious at having won the election but not being president, ran again in 1828. Jackson focused his efforts on calling out the corruption between Clay and Adams, which seemed to work on the voters, as Andrew Jackson won for real this time. Back in 1824, John Neal starts a series for Blackwood's magazine called American Writers. It focused on, believe it or not, American writers. Neal's profiles for this series are considered the first works focused on the history of American literature. John Neal also starts revealing himself as a supporter of women's rights during this time. Inspired by Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, John Neal had some ahead-of-his-time thoughts on women and their role in society. In 1824, he publishes his essay Men and Women, which outlines his desire for more education of women and the societal change of, quote, "I would have women treated like men, of common sense," unquote. His main argument in Men and Women boils down to the idea that women are not intellectually inferior to men, just different. He argues that women are more creative and imaginative, while men are more logical and better at abstract thinking. Whether he also thought men were from Mars and women were from Venus is unknown, but he did think that just because women might think differently than men, it didn't make them inferior. He argues, quote, "Things unlike cannot be compared so as to justify any inference respecting the inferiority of either. Homer and Shakespeare are unlike, but who shall decide up the superiority of either? The Thames and the Atlantic, the Transfiguration and the Laocoon, Demosthenes and Alexander, Handel's Messiah and the Enterprise of Columbus. They are all unalike. Yet who but a poet, an orator, or a madman would thereby infer the superiority of either. Unquote. Basically, he's arguing that just because women or men are different, you can't judge one as worse than the other. Not sure I fully buy Neal's women are creative, men are logical argument, but I like it a whole lot better than the more common refrain of women are inferior and unintelligent that was prevalent in Neal's day. 1825 saw John Neal shop around his newly finished novel, Brother Jonathan. William Blackwood, already publishing Neal's work for his magazine, happily agreed to publish the novel. However, this would be the end of their working relationship. There are two theories I've seen as to why this is, and as always, when presented with two options, we just cover both. Option 1. Neal and Blackwood had intense disagreements over various revisions of the manuscript. After all the fighting over the manuscript, their relationship decayed to a point where it was unsustainable. Option 2. Brother Jonathan was a huge flop. Described as a financial failure for Neal and Blackwood, this failure drove a wedge between the two. Sneaky surprise option 3, it was probably a mixture of both. Tensions were high after a rough editing phase, and the book flopping was the straw that broke the camel's back. Freed from his Blackwood commitments, which is a polite way of saying unemployed, John Neal started writing for various other periodicals in London. He also attended various London debating societies where he would meet reformer Jeremy Bentham. To quickly sum up Bentham's opinions, instead of me telling you who he is, I'm just going to read the first paragraph or so from his Wikipedia page. It paints a pretty good picture. Quote, he advocated individual and economic freedoms, the separation of church and state, freedom of expression, equal rights for women, the right to divorce, and, in an unpublished essay, the decriminalizing of homosexual acts. He called for the abolition of slavery, capital punishment, and physical punishment, including that of children. He also became known as an early advocate of animal rights. Unquote. So, by and large, a pretty progressive man for his time. Jeremy Bentham also has one more credit to his name. He was the father of a concept for a prison. The prison would be structured so that a single person could observe every prisoner, though not at the same time. This would mean that prisoners would never know if they were being watched or not, meaning they would be more likely to behave at all times. This prison concept was named the Panopticon. The building was never built, but the concept has lived on, if only in modern metaphors for state surveillance. Bentham hires Neal as his private secretary and offers him a place to stay. In addition to his work as Bentham's secretary, Neal also writes for Bentham's Westminster Review. In the spring of 1827, John Neal has had enough of England. After about 3 years abroad, Neal is ready to return home. Remember that Neal had goals for his trip to London. Become the leading voice on American literature, bring about an American literary style distinct from the British literary style, make the British respect American authors, and publish his work for a British audience. Neal got his novel published. It was a failure, but it got published. That's a win. At this point, he is kind of the leading voice on American literature after his American Writers series. We'll call that a kind of win. Neal also succeeded in educating the British about American life with his articles. He did not, however, establish himself as the leader of a new American literary style. And he was not really a successful author, so I'm not sure the British gained respect for American authors based on Neal. He had come to England as one of the most prominent American authors, but due to him only publishing one novel, and that novel being a failure, he had pretty much lost his prominence. Neal was not the pioneering American literary hero he had hoped he would be. So he goes home. Bentham generously pays for Neal's return voyage. John Neal is now 34 and in Portland again. His plan is to make a quick stop to check in on his mother and sister, then head to New York City. However, John Neal is in for a surprise. Portland kinda hates him. They didn't like his earlier novel Errata because it tried to depict the reality of life, which didn't reflect well on them. They didn't like how he wrote New England dialect into Brother Jonathan. And while his American Writers series was influential and historic, it also crapped all over some American writers that the people of Portland liked. Citizens of Portland would post writings around the city denouncing Neal and would confront him verbally and even physically as he walked down the street. It also probably didn't help that he had spent his last year in Portland before leaving for London, making enemies. Still, this hostility surprised Neal. Now, if it were me, I would have left. He already had plans to go to New York. Having everyone in town hate me would not make me want to stick around. However, John Neal is nothing if not stubborn. Instead of leaving, he stays and abandons his exodus to New York City. John Neal's quest to restore his image in the eyes of Portland starts with one of his loves, athletics. He felt that people needed ways to release aggression and violent tendencies in productive ways. So he opened a public gymnasium in Portland, the first public gymnasium in America, and the first gymnasium period in the state of Maine. Yeah, Maine's a state now. It happened in 1820. Neal was busy studying law and writing novels for me to mention it then. Neal's gymnasium focused on gymnastics, boxing, and fencing, 3 things he had learned in his travels to places like London and Baltimore. Neal reopened his law office now that he was back in town and would offer boxing lessons right in his offices. So, he'd get you off the hook and then teach you how to throw one. In 1828, Neal started Plan 2 of his image rehabilitation. He started the Yankee magazine. The Yankee was published between 1828 and 1829 and was mostly used for Neal to explain himself to the people of Portland. He also continued his quest for women's rights in the Yankee and called for more female voices in literature. 1828 also saw Neal publish Rachel Dyer, A North American Story. Rachel Dyer was the first novel to use the Salem witch trials as a setting, inspiring the books you actually know, like The Scarlet Letter, to use the setting as well. However, the novel is more known for the addition of an essay from Neal called The Unpublished Preface, which is an interesting name because it is published in the book, and Rachel Dyer already has a preface. We're going to cover some of it here, but first I want to cover the first few paragraphs of the actual preface of Rachel Dyer. Quote, I have long entertained a suspicion, all that has been said by the novel writers and dramatists and poets of our age to the contrary notwithstanding, that personal beauty and intellectual beauty, or personal beauty and moral beauty, are not inseparably connected with, nor apportioned to each other. An errata, a work of which, as a work, I am heartily ashamed now, I labored long and earnestly to prove this. I made my dwarf a creature of great moral beauty and strength. Godwin, the powerful, energetic, and philosophizing Godwin, saw a shadow of this truth, but he saw nothing more. The substance escaped him. He taught, and he has been followed by others, among whom are Browne, Scott, and Byron, I observe the chronological order, that a towering intellect may inhabit a miserable body, that heroes are not of necessity 6 feet high, nor of a godlike shape, and that we may be deceived if we venture to judge of the inward by the outward man. But they have stopped here. They did not perceive, or perceiving would not acknowledge, the whole truth. For if we consider a moment, we find that all their great men are scoundrels. Without one exception, I believe, their heroes are hypocrites or misanthropes, banditti, or worse, while their good men are altogether subordinate and pitiable, destitute of energy, and wholly without character. Now, believing as I do, in spite of such overwhelming authority, that a man may have a club foot, or a humpback, or even red hair, and yet be a good man, peradventure a great man, that a dwarf with a distorted shape may be a giant in goodness of heart and greatness of temper, and that moral beauty may exist where it appears not to have been suspected by the chief critics of our age, and of past ages, namely in a deformed body like that of Aesop, I have written this book. Unquote. It seems silly to us now that you would have to point out that people with things like a club foot or, red hair can have good moral qualities, but here we are. The main reason I wanted to read this section is because it references William Godwin as a figure of reverence and prominence. If you listen to my episode on Mary Shelley, you know that that's her dad, and I have a great fondness for that family. I also don't feel I did a great job showing how prominent and influential William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's parents, were in intellectual circles, which is why both have been included at various points in this episode. On to the unpublished preface, which is really John Neal's manifesto for his vision of American literature and authorship. To be clear, I have about 15 separate quotes in my research doc for this essay to potentially include here. I'm not going to use them all, but know that the writing here lays out a lot of what John Neal believed an American author was currently and what they could and should be in the future. Quote, "There is Washington Irving now. He has obtained the reputation of being what? Why, at best, of being only the American Addison in the view of the Englishman. And is this a title to care much for? Would such a name, though Addison stood far higher in the opinion of the English themselves than he now does or ever again will, be enough to satisfy the ambition of a lofty-minded, original thinker? Would such a man falter and reef his plumage midway up the altitude of his blinding and brave ascent to be called the American Addison, or even what in my view were 10,000 times better, the American Goldsmith? No! Up to the very keystone of the broad blue firmament, he would say, or back to the vile earth again, lower than the earth first. Understand me, however. I do not say this lightly nor disparagingly. I love and admire Washington Irving. I wish him all the reputation he covets, and of the very kind he covets. Our paths never did, never will cross each other. And so with Mr. Cooper and a multitude more of whom we may rightfully be proud, they have gained just enough popular favor to make them afraid of hazarding one jot or tittle of it by stepping aside onto a new path. No one of these could avail me in my design. They would have everything to lose and nothing to gain by embarking in it. Well, what had I to lose? Nay, what have I to lose? I am not now, I have never been, and I never shall be an author by trade. The opinion of the public is not the breath of life to me. For if the truth must be told, I have to this hour very little respect for it, so long as it is indeed the opinion of the public, of the mere multitude, the careless, unthinking judgment of the mob, unregulated by the wise and thoughtful." Unquote. Given that Neal stayed in Portland solely due to his public perception, saying the opinion of the public is not the breath of life to him is a little funny. It definitely was, at least sometimes. Saying he never was and never will be an author is kinda true. He never makes his living solely as an author. if we accept author to solely mean person who writes novels. He does, at various points, make his living as a writer, though. Neal references Addison and Goldsmith. You don't really need to know who they were just two popular authors from the UK at this time. Neal's point in calling out the comparison is that no American author who tries to imitate the British style will ever be respected as their own writer in the eyes of the British public. They'll only be regarded as the American version of a British writer. By writing in the British style, Neal argues that, quote, "At the best, all such things are but imitations." And what are imitations? Sheer mimicry, more or less exalted to be sure, but still mimicry. Wherever the copies of life are copied and not life itself, a sort of high-handed, noonday plagiarism, nothing more. People are never amazed, nor carried away, nor uplifted by imitations. They are pleased with the ingenuity of the artist. They are delighted with the closeness of the imitation. But that is all. The better the work is done, the worse they think of the workman. Neal makes an interesting point about imitations never amazing or uplifting people, which is probably broadly true. I'm not sure I fully buy the fact that imitations make people think worse about the creator of the original, though it does have a logic to it. But I've seen a lot of really good imitations of the Mona Lisa or the Starry Night, and I'm still pretty impressed by Da Vinci and Van Gogh. And I know it's pronounced Van Gogh or whatever, but it'll always be Van Gogh in my head. I'm sorry. Back to Neal. Quote, "The British are a nation of writers. Their novel writers are as a cloud. True, true, but they still want something which they have not. They want a real American writer, one with courage enough to write in his native tongue. That they have not, even at this day. That they have never had. Our best writers are English writers, not American writers. They are English in everything they do and in everything they say, as authors in the structure and moral of their stories, in their dialogue, speech, and pronunciation, yea, in the very characters they draw. Not so much as one true Yankee to be found in any of our native books. Hardly so much as one true Yankee phrase." Unquote. This is the crux of Neal's argument, that an American author can offer the English-speaking world something that no British writer ever could. That the two groups are fundamentally different, and each can offer things the other can't. Pretty much the same argument he made for women not being intellectually inferior, just different. Alright, big long quote coming now, but this will be the last one, I promise. Quote, "Another was to teach my countrymen that these very Englishmen, to whom as the barbarians of ancient story did by their gods when they would conciliate them, we are accustomed to offer up our own offspring with our own hands, whenever we see the sky darkening over the water. The sky inhabited of them, aye, that these very Englishmen, to whom we are so in the habit of immolating all that is beautiful and grand among us, the firstborn of our youth, are creatures of immortality, are men of genius, while in the fever and flush of their vanity, innocence, and passion, ere they have had time to put out their first plumage to the sky and the wind, all above and about them, that they, these very Englishmen, would not love us the less, nor revere us the less, if we loved and revered ourselves, and the issue of our blood and breath and vitality and power a little more. No, the men of England are men. They love manhood. They may smile at our national vanity, but their smile would be one of compassionate benevolence and encouragement. If we were wise enough to keep our young at home, till their first molting season were well over, and then offer to pair them, even though there would be a little presumption in it, high up in the skies in the strong wind with their bravest and best, not as we do now upon the altars of the earth, upon the tables of our money changers, half fledged and untrained, with their legs tied and their wings clipped, or peradventure with their necks turned and heads all skewered under their tails, a heap of carrion and garbage that the braver birds, even among their enemies, would disdain to stoop at. Such would be their behavior if we dealt as we ought with our own. There would be no pity nor disdain with them. They would cheer us to the conflict, pour their red wine down our throats if we were beaten. And if their birds were beaten, they would bear it with temper, knowing that their reputation could well afford an occasional triumph to the young of their favorite brood. The men of England are waiting to do us justice, but there is a certain formality to be gone through with before they will do it. We must claim it. And why should we not? I do not mean that we should claim it upon our knees as the condemned of their courts of justice are compelled to claim that mercy which the very law itself has predetermined to grant to him, but will not unless that idle and unworthy formality has been submitted to. No, I mean no such thing. We do not want mercy, and I would have my countrymen, when they are arraigned before any mere English tribunal, not acting under the law of nations in the world of literature, to go at once with a calm front and untroubled eye and plead to their jurisdiction with a loud, clear voice, and with their right hand upon the great book of English law, and set them at defiance. This they have the right and the power to do, and why should they not, when some of the inferior courts, of mere English criticism, have the audacity at every little interval to call upon a sovereign people to plead before them without counsel and be tried for some infringement of some paltry municipal provision of their statute book, some provincialism of language, or some heresy in politics, or some plagiarism of manner or style, and abide the penalty of forgery, or of ecclesiastical censure, or the reward of petite larceny, retransportation, or rebanishment to America. It is high time now that we should begin to do each other justice. Let us profit by their good qualities, and let them by ours. And in time we shall assuredly come to feel like brothers of the same parentage, an elder and a younger, different in temper, but alike in family resemblance, and alike proud of our great ancestry, the English giants of olden time. We shall revere our brother, and he will love his. But when shall this be? Not, I am sorely afraid, till we have called home all our children from the four corners of the earth, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south, and held a congress of the dead, of their fathers and of our fathers, and published to the world and to posterity, appealing again to Jehovah for the rectitude of our intentions, another declaration of independence in the great republic of letters. And yet this may soon be. The time is even now at hand. Our representatives are assembling, the dead Greek and the Roman, the ancient English, and the fathers of literature from all the buried nations of all the earth, and holding council together and choosing their delegates. And the generation is already born that shall yet hear the heavens ringing with acclamations of their decree, that another state has been added to the everlasting confederacy of literature. Unquote. The way Neal talks about American and English authors is very much an attitude of the time. This is post-War of 1812. America and the UK have fought the final war against each other. From this point on, America and the UK are allies, right up to the present day. But there is always that family relationship that lingers. More so than any of the other colonies turned countries, the UK and America have a kind of older sibling, younger sibling relationship. There is occasional hostility and bickering, but at the core there is love, even if neither side is willing to admit it very often. Neal would publish two more novels that he likely wrote during his time in London in 1830 and 1833. 1828 saw Neal start his love affair with short stories. He started pumping out short stories like no one's business, publishing roughly one a year between 1828 and 1846. 1828 also saw John Neal marry Eleanor Hall, his second cousin. The two would have 5 children together. Now, I don't know why all the authors of this time period married their cousins. Poe did it, Neal does it. It was a thing. Not my cup of tea, but whatever floats your boat in the old family gene pool. Neal was described by his apprentice James Brooks during this time. He said that Neal was, quote, a boxing master and fencing master too, and as a printer's devil came in crying, "Copy, more copy," he would race with a huge swan's quill, full gallop, over sheets of paper as with a steam pen, and off went one page, and off went another, and then a lesson in boxing, the thump of glove to glove, then the mask and the stamp of the sandal, and the ringing of the foils, unquote. 1829 would see Neal begin his career as a traveling lecturer. He lectured on things like literature, eloquence, fine arts, temperance, languages, women's rights, self-education, and self-reliance. The most notable thing to come from his work as a lecturer was in 1832 when he gave the first women's rights lecture with what has become known as the Rights of Women speech. John Neal was, in my opinion, on the right side of history for quite a few hot-button issues of the time, arguing against slavery, arguing against the poor treatment of Native Americans, and he had a reasonable take on temperance. Despite enjoying the occasional glass of wine, John Neal joined the temperance movement, believing that overindulgence in alcohol was bad, but the occasional use was fine, which is why he also quickly split from the official temperance movement when they started pushing complete prohibition. The 1830s would see John Neal relax a bit. After he received a sizable inheritance from two of his uncles dying, he dialed way back on literature. He still wrote short stories until the early 1840s, but after his novel in 1833, which he likely wrote during his time in London, he wouldn't write another novel in the 1830s. The 1840s also didn't see a Neal novel, with his only long-form written work being a novella. 1845 would seal the coffin, though. Mutual Benefit Life Insurance offered him a job selling life insurance. He became their first salesman in the state of Maine. And John Neal, who remember started as a dry goods salesman when he was 12, was good at selling insurance. In fact, he was so good and he made so much money from his commissions that he retired from the law, the lecture circuit, and most of his writing. After decades of fiery articles and arguments, most of Neal's contemporaries assumed he died sometime in the 40s, mainly based on the assumption that there was no way Neal could be quiet this long without being 6 feet under. But he wasn't. He was just a local insurance salesman doing local work. In fact, for most of the 1840s and 1850s, the only thing to note is that Neal converted to Congregationalism in the 1851. It's the only real footnote of the 2-decade span, until 1859, which we'll get to. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of this episode, I called John Neal the Paul Morphy of the literary world. Paul Morphy was an American chess player who came to prominence in the late 1850s. He traveled America and Europe as a young man and challenged the best chess players of the day and completely dominated them. He was inarguably the best player of his era and is still talked about as one of the best chess players of all time. However, at the height of his prowess, Morphy gave up chess, claiming that it was not something worthy of serious attention. Instead, Morphy pursued a career as a lawyer and would never play serious chess again. Neal was arguably not at his peak, nor was he head and shoulders above his peers like Morphy, But the similarities are there. He devoted a lot of his early life to the thing he's known for, only to give it up pretty much cold turkey for a large chunk of his life. And they were both lawyers. Might as well be twins. I also found it interesting that Neal's interest in literature started to wane in the 1830s when he finally got some money from his uncle's inheritance. And it pretty much died completely once his job as an insurance salesman took off. As I research writers' lives for this show, I've noticed a trend. When they get money, they stop writing. This is especially noticeable in this era when writer was really starting to be an actual career. Mary Shelley pretty much stopped writing once her son got his inheritance. Poe admitted he only wrote what he did because of how it would sell, and Neal abandoned literature once he was finally financially secure. We have this idea that writers write because they have to. They have this thing inside of them that they have to get out, and ink and parchment are the only things that will satisfy the desire. I resonated a lot with that as a teenager. I felt that carnal hunger to express myself to the page constantly. As I've gotten older, I think I resonate more with that desire to just stop, to lay down the quill and just be done with it. Those of you who have seen my release schedule for this probably aren't shocked at that. Now, to be clear, writing can be cathartic, it can be therapeutic, but it can also be incredibly taxing. And sometimes you just want to stop pouring yourself into the cold blank page, especially if you don't have to make a living. So, what does John Neal do now that he no longer writes like he's running out of time? Well, picture an old timey rich person in America. What would they do? First things first, real estate. John Neal starts buying and developing real estate. Next up, railroads. John Neal buys up various railroad connections. He also buys a couple granite quarries, because, why not? He also became involved in local events. He led the charge for the incorporation of Portland as a city, and he built the city's first parks and sidewalks. All classic old-timey rich person things. I mentioned earlier that he converted to Congregationalism in 1851, and that gave him a little spark of inspiration, and John Neal wrote a series of 7 religious essays, which would be published in 1854 in the book One Word More. In 1859, due to the urging of his friends and writers he inspired, Neal returns to novels with True Womanhood. He would also write 3 dime novels in the early 1860s. Now, for those of you who don't know, dime novels were basically mass-produced, relatively short books that were sold for 10 cents. The modern equivalent might be the paperback books you sometimes see in supermarkets, or a direct-to-TV movie, something that isn't necessarily meant to be good, just cheap and enjoyable enough. 1869, at the age of 76, John Neal writes his autobiography, Wandering Recollections of a Somewhat Busy Life. This re-examination of his life caused Neal to take a more prominent stand as an activist, involving himself in the local women's suffrage movement and even taking a leadership role. 1870 sees a book for and about children written and published by Neal called Great Mysteries and Little Plagues. He would write his final book in 1874, Portland Illustrated, a guidebook to the city he had helped incorporate and had lived in most of his life. Finally, on June 20th, 1876, John Neal dies at the age of 82. His net worth was estimated to be roughly $80,000. Using our ever-reliable internet inflation calculator, that's roughly $2 million in today's money. Because you may have forgotten, this is the same man who left home at 12 because his mother couldn't afford him. The same man who went bankrupt in his 20s after his business failed due to the war ending. The same man who was broke and destitute on the streets of London in his 30s until he found work in a magazine. $2 million at the end of his life? Not too bad. As we're coming to the end, you may be tempted to view John Neal's literary goals as failures. He wanted to usher in an age of American authorship, and he really didn't. However, he inspired some of the men who would actually accomplish his goals. John Greenleaf Whittier, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow all received their first taste of public praise from John Neal. Some of those names are giants in early American literature. Neal's other goal was American dialect to be used in writing, and while there wasn't a huge swath of writers to take up this banner, Neal won in the end. For just a second, think of the prototypical American author, the author that most screams American to you. Now, for me, that's Mark Twain, an author known for using natural dialect in his writing. And to put this on a timeline for you, Neal published his final book in 1874. 2 years later, Mark Twain would publish The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. About 8 years after that, the sequel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, would be hailed as the great American novel, and the book is known for, among other things, its use of everyday English and regionalisms. Mark Twain, in a lot of ways, is who John Neal wanted to be. He fulfilled the promise that John Neal laid out. In that way, John Neal emulates an earlier John, who was, quote, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. As John the Baptist came before Jesus, Neal came before Twain, with both Johns laying the groundwork for their successors. But Mark Twain is not the literary messiah, just a very naughty boy who became everything Neal wanted from an American author. A religious ending with a Monty Python twist. That'll work. The John the Baptist comparison kept coming up as I thought about Twain and Neal, and so I had to figure out some way to include it. A couple admin things here. First of all, if you notice that the podcast has new art, that was a gift of an old friend of mine who started listening to the podcast and made that for me. The art on my website and Twitter cover image is also made by a listener. Thank you to you both. Also, sorry for the long delay between episodes. I got distracted for a while, and then once I locked back in, I got pretty sick. On a good news front, we already have a topic for our next episode. It's the first ever suggestion I've received. So if there's a storyteller you want me to cover, but you didn't suggest them because you assumed I wouldn't actually cover them, joke's on you. Send them over. Or if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out on Twitter at StoryOfStoryTLR. Or, if you've abandoned Twitter, which is completely reasonable, feel free to email me at storyofthestorytellers@gmail.com. Finally, to steal a quote from a pair of goofs, Soupy Twists.